Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Q&A Cafe for SAP Business One. Today we're doing formatted searches in Business One with Alex Waddell, and we are going to be recording the session, so everybody will be on mute for the duration of this session. If you have any questions or you just want to chat, you can put in your questions in the chat box or the questions box, and we'll get to them when we can. After this session is over, about 2 days later, an automatic email will go out with this recording. So look out for that, as well as some information around registering for the next session, which is Crystal Reports in SAP Business One. So without further ado, I'm going to put myself on mute and I'll hand it back to Alex.
Great, thanks, Kayla. So welcome, everyone. Right, so we're here at the Q&A Cafe to talk a little bit about formatted searches. I'm a finance background, longtime VistaView employee. In fact, I'm such a dinosaur, I still call them formatted searches, and I don't think SAP has called them that for quite a while. So SAP probably uses the terms now called user-defined values. But if you've been around for a while, or if you look at some of the documentation, you may still see reference to something called formatted searches. But both of those are the same thing. So this is a minor customization that you can do to your system. If you don't have access to this under your tools menu, it's a permissions issue, so your administrator may help you with that. And you would definitely want to sort of work jointly with an administrator because what you are doing here could impact the product and the way it sort of behaves for other people as well. So make sure there's maybe agreement in your organization if you are going to make user-defined values appear in some of the screens. So I think in other sessions, we may have talked about user-defined fields or user-defined tables. Just very briefly, I won't go into them, but the difference between them is a user-defined field is a field that you can append to a data element inside the system. You can append it at the header level, or you can append it at the table level for the rows of a document. The way it adds the data is similar, but the way it looks on the screen is very different because user-defined fields on a document will appear on a panel on the right side, and user-defined fields added to the rows will just appear as a new column inside the grid in, for example, a purchase order or an AR invoice. So depending on your needs, you would determine where you want to create user-defined fields, and user-defined fields can be free text fields. They can be fields that behave in a certain way, so for dates or numbers, for accounting, or they could be a drop-down list where you're maintaining that data somewhere as a controlled list that the user can invoke a value off of. And then a user-defined table is an even more complex setup. So now you're essentially saying you want to set up an entire table specific to your environment, and you don't want to necessarily leverage off of an existing SAP table. So a user-defined table would allow you to say, let's say you needed to create a table, for example, of like some sort of commission structure, and you wanted to put multiple fields in with different data, like in addition to your salespeople, their regions, things like that, that could be factors in doing calculations for commissions. So that could be a good example of what you might use a user-defined tables, but the sky's the limit. And then lastly, user-defined values or formatted searches. What you're here for today is to really look at how you can modify an existing field inside the system to behave a little bit differently, to behave more like a drop-down, to help you shortcut some information from a query. And so it can actually be quite useful to bring some consistency to the way people do data entry, or to allow you to pull some information from associated records and save you from having to go and look things up. So let's talk about the sort of simplest scenarios first to work our way up to the most complex. So you'll see that this is grayed out. In order to really start creating user-defined value, you need to be sitting in the field that you want to work in. So I'm just going to go into any screen. It doesn't really matter. Let's maybe go into something like an AP invoice. And I'm going to start entering an invoice. Maybe one thing I will just quickly check here is if there is I don't think there are any user-defined fields on here, because I was going to show you the panel on the right. So we'll see if we can find one of those screens later. Okay, so for now, oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, there isn't any. So yeah, as I mentioned, a user-defined field would show up on a panel on the right. So there isn't any on this particular screen, but that's where they would locate. All right, so let's start an invoice. And let's say we're just going to pick a really simple example in a text. This example may not be that meaningful, but I just want you to understand how this works. So if you wanted to create some sort of a user-defined value dropdown, then once your cursor is in that particular field, you can go to your tools menu and you can go back to where we just were. So customize tool shift. You can also use the shift alt F2. So we're going to go into the user-defined value setup. And there's sort of three different modes that every field can be set in. So out of the box, everything is set as without a user-defined field. And then you have the option of doing your own user-defined list or linking it to a query. So a list is the most straightforward. We'll start with that one. And then it just gives you a little pop-up screen where you can maintain your list. So it doesn't matter what your list is, something that's meaningful to your business. And we'll stop at that point and we'll hit the update button. And so what it's done, it's very subtle, but it's added a little magnifying glass to your field. And that's the indicator that there is now a formatted search available inside this field. Doesn't mean you have to use the formatted search, but it is there. So if I click on the magnifying glass, then the system is going to give me my pop-up list. And it's as simple as that. So let's talk a little bit about what some of the advantages and disadvantages to this. So user-defined fields do not enforce you to follow the list. I can completely ignore this information. So it doesn't matter what I type in, it'll let me out of the field because this field is natively a free text field. So it's kind of saying, well, I don't care what you put in there. However, if you do want to use the pop-up list, it'll just give you those recommendations. So except don't pop the list while you have data in there, otherwise it's searching for it. So kind of as simple as that. And it's going to be available now in every single row if you have done it inside the column. You could have also done the same thing, up in a field up here somewhere. So this is the most simple example. If you do want to enforce data integrity, you want this drop-down list to absolutely be what people entered, then this is not the right solution for you. If that's what you're looking for, then you probably want to create a user-defined field and have that on the panel on the right, because those fields could be designed so that the drop-down is enforced and you can only pick from the list, whereas this one is not. So depending on your business reason for this, that may be a good thing, that may be a bad thing. So that's the most simple example. Maybe I'll just pause for a second and just, if anybody does have questions as we're going along, feel free to drop them in the chat panel or the question panel, and I'd be happy to take the questions as they come up. Now, if we move on to a bit more of a complex example, let's look at something that's actually working off of a query. So in this case, I have a GL account field, and when I click on the drop-down list, it gives me a list of every single GL account in the system. So this is just standard SAP Business One behavior, and I can put anything that I want in there. So here could be a place where a query-based formatted search could be useful, because typically, if you are coding an AP invoice, you're coding it almost always, maybe 95% of the time, to just an expense account. So it might be nice if this pop-up filtered out all of your balance sheet accounts and just showed you a subset of accounts. So how would we accomplish that? We would accomplish that by creating a query. And I don't want to turn this little short session into how to write queries. But if you do need help with that, we may have some YouTube videos, or we are happy to run some sessions on that. So I went in advance and I created a few queries. Query writing in the system is not overly difficult for simple queries. I'm not a technical person. Like I said, I'm an accountant, and I'm able to create those. So I went into my query manager, or I'm going into my query manager, and I wrote this query a little early on. And so it's just a very simple query that's saying, just give me a list of only my kind of P&L accounts. So I kind of went in here and I said, bring in the segments that I need, concatenate them together. That's what's going on as this part of the query. And then I'm essentially saying anything that doesn't start with a 1, 2, or a 3, because that's my assets, my liabilities, and my retained earnings. And where the postable flag is turned to yes. And then I put in a little sort code. So this is in essence giving me a list. And this is really just a freestanding report that anybody could run in the system. It's an available query. But now I want to link this query to my formatted search. So we will do that by once again making sure we're in the field. We're going to go to our tools menu. We're going to go to customization tools, and we're going to go to user-defined values. So previously, we had created our own list. Now we want to do something a bit more robust. We're going to go into search in existing user-defined values according to a saved query. At that point, it gives us an option to open a saved query. And now it's going to launch your query manager where all of your eligible queries are. And so I'm just going to link it to my expense account query. And I'll come back to this in a moment. These are additional kind of enhancements we're going to get into, but for now, we're going to keep it simple. We're going to update it. And so you may have noticed that the icon changed a little bit. Instead of being the normal sort of circle drop-down list like you see, sort of like this one up here, you get your magnifying glass. So now when the user goes to the GL account screen, they are just getting those accounts that I designed in my query. I decided to include, my 4s, my 5s, and my 6s. So I can, code my invoice accordingly. And then when I go to my next row, should there be a time when I actually want to get around this, maybe I do want to code something to, prepaids or something on the balance sheet, because that button has disappeared and been replaced by the magnifying glass, there is no icon to do that. However, if you just use the tab key on your keyboard, which is probably something you're used to, the tab key invokes the original list. It does not invoke your formatted search. So keep that in mind. I can now still go in here and I could, let's say code something to a prepaid expense account this way. So just a very simple example of where a query can kind of assist you with maybe making your business process a little bit smoother. If you start, kind of building some simple ones like that, what typically happens is you'll start to come up with ideas all through the system for, well, how maybe advancing the sophistication on a dropdown can make your process flow a little smoother. So one thing that I will mention is with the drop-down lists, so if you are creating your own drop-down list like I am here, you cannot overlay a drop-down list here with a SAP list field and have different values. So for example, I could not link blue, green, yellow into my GL account and force that to go because it would still throw an error when I left the field because it knows that a GL account has to go in that field. So just keep that in mind. You can't change the nature of the way the field ultimately works. You can, though, filter the data so that you just look at a little bit less records. Okay, let's look at something even a bit more sophisticated. We'll go into another document. Oh, thanks, Connie Rose. She was just enforcing in the questions that they still call them formatted searches. Okay, thank you. I'm not quite the dinosaur then. Okay, I'm going to do one in an AR invoice. So this one's going to get a little bit more sophisticated. I want to create one where maybe I'm pulling some information relating to something else that's going on in the form. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull in my customer. And let's say that this particular customer has information in the customer file that I would like to draw onto the invoice to have it shown. So if I were, for example, to open up this invoice, and You decide where you're going to store that information, what's the information you need, but you could essentially retrieve anything from the customer record and pull it into one of your other fields, assuming that that field supports that type of data using the formatted search. So for example, if I want to go to my remarks and I have some sort of a comment, maybe with some shipping instructions that say always send as priority mail, attention Susan, this information is kind of buried inside the customer data. How would I get it to appear on my AR invoice, and where would I want to put it? So think about all of those things. So maybe we'll take advantage of the actual remarks field in the footer of the invoice. So I'm going to go down here, I'm going to go to my tools, and I'm going to go to my customization tools, user-defined values, and I'm going to invoke a query, and this is a query that I wrote previously. And so I called this one the remarks lookup query. So now I have a little magnifying glass here. So when I click on the magnifying glass, you can see that it has pulled in the remarks. So this is pretty clever because it's actually, how did it know to go and get that value for this particular customer? I'll show you that in a moment. And what does that mean? So for example, let's say I want to choose to a different customer. Oh, bad choice because I'm picking an unusual currency. Let me pick something in USA. Okay, so it's remembered what was already in this record. It hasn't automatically updated it. So I have to hit my formatted search again. And now it's checking this particular customer. And in this customer, the remarks field is blank, and hence it blanked it out. So that's okay, but it could be a little bit problematic because you could have the scenario that we just happened. Maybe we selected the wrong customer by mistake, and we want this information to be, sort of slightly automated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my tools menu again. We're going to go back. So make sure you're in your remarks field where your user-defined value exists. And instead of, I'm going to enhance this and I'm going to turn on some of the auto refresh field. So auto refresh when the field changes, well, which field? That's really up to you. It can be based on any field inside the screen here, and you'll see when I evoke this list. But since the data is really relating to the customer, it's pretty logical here that I would probably want this to be related to when the customer information is modified to relaunch my formatted search. So either one of these, customer code, customer name, I'll just do the code. And you could set it to sort of just happen regularly, and this is a fairly safe way because it'll just sort of check as soon as that data changes. So I'm going to hit the update button here. So we're still sitting on Earthshaker Corporation. Let's go take that out. Let's decide that we're going to actually go back to invoicing our MaxiTech. And so you see that the moment I changed the customer, I did not have to hit my magnifying glass. It automatically retrieved that because of that radio button that I turned on in the formatted search. And same thing if we go back to one of our other customers, change to any of them, it automatically blanks out that information. So keep that in mind because that's a very sort of powerful way to use the formatted searches. So let's talk a little bit about how this query is more sophisticated. These are a bit more challenged to write, and you may need to rely on some documentation, and I'm going to help you out with that in a moment. So I'm going to go into my query manager, and I'm going to look at that remarks lookup query, and I'm just going to run it. So you see when I run it, I actually get a red bar at the bottom. It tells me there's a syntax error because this query on its own, without being associated with a formatted search, is meaningless to the system. The reason it's meaningless is because there is some syntax in this query that applies specifically to what's going on in the AR invoice screen. So it's not super complicated, but it is typically associated right after the where clause in your query. So what I'm saying here is go and get the free text field from table OCRD. What is table OCRD? Table OCRD is the customer record data. So let's open up that table for a moment. Let's go to the remarks field. And then if you're not aware of this, go to your view and make sure that system information is turned on. Therefore, you have a checkbox here. And when that is turned on, what that will mean is as your mouse is hovering over the field, I can't move my mouse down to show you, but if you go and look at the very bottom left-hand corner, quite a small font, you'll see that it says form 134, item 21, pane 5, variable 1. And at the very end of all that, it tells you the name of the table. So the table is OCRD, and the field is called free text. So I don't necessarily need to learn all of the table structures. I don't need to have a dictionary because SAP exposes all of that information for you by turning on that setting. So very important if you're trying to write a query and you're trying to understand how to get a piece of data onto your query. So that's where this information comes from, free text from OCRD. And then I want this, what is the where clause? So from OCRD where, card code, so card code is this information up here, that's this field, equals, and then you get this strange thing here that looks like it doesn't mean anything. So $, square bracket, $4.0.0. What does that mean? That is essentially a address on this screen for it to look up the information. So when I'm sitting down here inside a particular screen, I have a query running, and that query is saying, I want you to go look up a piece of information based on the customer here. So how do I tie it together? If I hover over this field, you can see at the very bottom left, it's saying that the form number is 133 and the item number is number 4. And that is exactly what the query is doing. So it's saying, go and look inside the customer table where the customer ID equals item number 4 on the screen. So once you start to understand those mechanics, you can do some pretty powerful things to kind of create queries to help you do all sorts of things in other fields, but relating to data that's already on the screen. So for example, if you wanted to invoke some information relating to the salesperson that you put on the screen, you could select the salesperson, and then you could have some other field populate with information relating to that salesperson, maybe their phone number or something like that. So once you start building some of these queries, the options become endless. You'll think of all sorts of ways that you could enhance your screens to be a bit more robust for your needs. So just to close this off, a document that's probably very helpful to you is going to be this one here. This is how to use, define and use user-defined values. This is an SAP guide. It's a PDF that you can download. I'm actually going to stick this into the chat panel, and I believe I can say send to entire audience. So inside your GoToMeeting, you should see a link to this in the chat panel. Feel free to download this guide. It's actually quite excellent. In fact, I sort of lifted one of those queries that we saw out of that book. And you'll see a lot of that same information. So here it's telling you how to write some sample queries. This section is really useful because it really helps you understand how the information is getting into the screens. And you'll see they've got a few different examples. So copy row value field to another user-defined field. So they're telling you how to essentially move data from one part of the screen to the other, how to retrieve a currency symbol from a portion of your screen, copy a user-defined fields value to a system field. So you can look up information in one of your user-defined fields. So once again, that panel on the right side, grab some of that information and bring it into one of the SAP screens, SAP fields. Calculate a value from a field. So here's a simple query where they're saying, take the date and add 20 days to it. So that could be useful if you're trying to, automate, do something with due dates outside of what the system is already doing. Here's a query on just doing some calculations. So it's doing some arithmetic between different values in different fields. Look up the value from a database. So this is exactly the one that oh no, this is the balance. So it's saying go get the customer balance from the customer table where the card code, and then you recognize the end of the query is exactly the same as mine. So instead of getting the remarks field, we're getting the balance. So that's a great query. Hey, I want to send out an invoice, and on that invoice, I want to sort of show what's already owing to the customer. So lots of ideas. I won't read these all to you, but it's a great resource. And the first few pages go into quite a bit of detail explaining how they work. So feel free to explore that. Maybe just to close, I'm not going to send out this document because it's a bit dated. But I have just this goes back to like 2014. And the reason I'd rather not send this out is because these queries are actually written for Microsoft SQL. So part of me being ancient with doing this is now if you're using B1 on HANA, the SQL query writer, the syntax is a little bit different. So these queries won't quite work. But just gives you an idea of some of the things that I've done in the past. And then I would just sort of save this in my little dictionary in case I ever needed to use them again. So I had a little query that was like, go get the next project code from a database and add 1 to it. And some client needed something like that would just increase the project number by 1. Here's the query for selecting your expense accounts. So this one is written in the old format. The one that I just showed you in our test environment is written in the new format. Here's a very simple formatted search that just blanks a field out. So select double quotations, it just removes whatever's in that field. Here's one that actually brings up a list of all the system users, and you can select a user and populate it into your document. This one was kind of useful, especially for Canadian clients with GST, where it would actually go in and determine whether no tax should be coming, and it sort of eliminates some $0 entries on the system. So if you're having any, I don't know if that's still an issue in current versions or not, but if you're having issues with $0 entries in your tax accounts, there's probably a formatted search that could solve that for you. And then this is the remarks one. So just to give you an idea of the kinds of things you can do, but like I said, sky's the limit. So feel free to play with this feature, especially if you have access to your test environment, and you will come up with all sorts of creative ways to use it. So that's really what I had to show. Does anyone else have any more questions? I'm going to assume not, because I think they would be popping up as they came into people's heads. So that's probably all that I have to show. But if you do think of something after this, or if you get stuck on one of your formatted searches and can't get it to work right, do feel free to reach out to your representative at VistaView, and we'd be happy to help you. Back to you, Kayla.
Great, thanks, Alex. And I will correct myself. I said that we had another session next week, but actually it's every second week we have Business One. So in 2 weeks' time, we'll have on October 15th, I believe, the crystal reports for SAP Business One. So we'll see you then, and have a great rest of your day and weekend.